千里之行，始于足下。A journey of 1,000 miles begins beneath the feet. We now gather in the Tao to travel the journey together.
So previously, we went through 26 line by line, and we picked out a few characters to explain individually. And that's, of course, for the benefit of the people who are studying Chinese. We generally don't talk about every single character because that's not really practical for everyone. Instead, we focus on the meaning. So last time we got to the very last line, and I just want to remind everyone that we talked about a very important concept in studying the Tao Te Ching, and that is how the end of a chapter will tie back to the beginning of that chapter. In this particular case, we have a very obvious example. We have an example that doesn't require a lot of figuring out. It's right in front of us. So last time we talked about the correspondence between line 9 toward the very end to line 1, the very beginning. They both talk about the concept of heaviness and lightness, and this is not physical weight. This is about a mental state, an approach to life. So line 9, that talks about to be light is to lose one's root. Line 1 talks about heaviness is the root of lightness. So in other words, to be light is to lose heaviness. And heaviness is the thoughtful, deliberate approach. So in a similar way, the very last line, line 10, goes back to line 2 toward the beginning. So the very last line says to be restless is to lose one's mastery. Line 2 says quietness is the master of restlessness. So to be restless and also to be light would be the wrong approach to the Tao and the wrong approach to life. The correct approach, the better approach, advised by Lao Tzu, is to approach with this concept of heaviness and quietness. So to illustrate that principle, this is not exactly a familiar concept to us in the West, so it requires some illustration. People who perhaps glance at the Tao or have heard of the Tao in the West, perhaps they heard about concepts like Wan Wu, the myriad things, the 10,000 things. Perhaps they've heard of a concept like Wu Wei, non-action, or actually what it means is unattached action. But they are not likely to have heard anything about the idea of heavy versus light. So we have an opportunity to explain that, and what I attempted to do was to explain through a story. So this is the story that I told last time. The recording of this is up on YouTube, so many thanks to Mark, who works really hard to make those recordings available to everyone. So even if you missed last Sunday's meeting, there's an opportunity to go back and look at the recording on YouTube. It's easy to find and readily available. If you have any trouble locating that or any other video recording, I would strongly recommend that you join the Facebook group where you can ask questions about a particular recording from the past. This particular story, washing dishes, comes from chapter 23 of the Tao of Success. This is one of the books that I wrote, and the attempt was to connect these ancient stories with the Tao, specifically in a way that can lead to life transformation. So washing dishes is a story from toward the end of the book. The book contains 25 stories, and this is the 23rd. So it's near the end. The book itself is actually a favorite for me personally. It still is what I consider to be the collection of the very best stories from the Tao tradition. So, after hearing that story last time, if you were present last time to hear the story, then this next slide will make a lot of sense to you. We went through this point by point last time. The overall question was, hey, can you connect the story to the concepts from 26? So this story originally was there to emphasize the importance of knowing how to apply Tao concepts. Another message from the story, when you hear about these young men who were being tested and they try to do different things in their solution to the test. So, one person followed directions, the other two came up with their own way. One decided to wash as many as possible, thinking that would be the fastest way and therefore the best way. And another one applied the Tao of moderation and altered the instruction, altered the direction to follow, to make it conform to the Tao, at least in his own mind. So at the end of it, the message that I hope everybody got from the story was that when you're proceeding cautiously in this heaviness that Lao Tzu is talking about, it means that you are much more deliberate and mindful, and that it also means that you follow directions and not veer off on your own without a good reason. And this is all about, as I say here, learning to walk before you try to run, learning to run before you try to fly. So to be frivolous, the opposite, to be light, in this context, would be changing the rules to suit yourself, even before you really understand the purpose and the reasoning behind the rules. So that is one way to depict heavy versus light from 26. There is another way. There are many other stories that depict the difference between the two. And I also want to make a point about balancing between the two. Now, to help me illustrate more examples of heavy versus light, light versus heavy, I want to share another story with you that I didn't get to do last time. This is a story, unpublished, that I call the inheritance. So the story of inheritance, it goes like this. Once upon a time, in ancient China, there was a young man who was summoned by his elderly and terminally ill father. The young man knew his father did not have long to live, despite the best medical care available. So for that reason, he hurried to his father's side. Sadly, the young man was not in time. His father passed away before they could speak. The son was now the head of the family, responsible for putting his father's affairs in order. And that, of course, includes whatever his father might have wanted to pass down to him as inheritance. So that inheritance, as it turns out, was only one item, a painting. So the young man, the son, felt rather disappointed because he grew up looking at this painting. So to him, it wasn't anything special. There wasn't anything remarkable about it. It had been in his family for as long as he could remember. Because he grew up looking at it, and it didn't really appeal to him in any particular way. He didn't consider it to be especially beautiful or valuable. It was just decoration on the wall of the living room. So he decided to put it away. He wanted to take the painting down to move it to storage. So he took it off the wall. As soon as he did that, he was surprised by the weight of the painting. It seemed heavier than paintings that he had encountered before. So right away, a thought occurred to him. Was there perhaps more to the painting than it appeared? So he shook the painting slightly, and he definitely felt something loose rattling inside. He thought, perhaps the painting was just a false front. So to test that idea, he pulled back one corner of the painting, and he discovered he was right. His suspicion was correct. There was something golden and gleaming sandwiched between the painting and the backboard of the wooden frame. So he tore that corner off, and he saw, indeed, it was a gold leaf. It's shaped to be thin, but fairly large, so it could be easily hidden behind the painting. And even better, it looked like it might not be the only piece. So the young man was excited. He quickly tore off the rest of the painting, revealing many more gold leaves, all flattened in the same way. Altogether, they were, well, not exactly a fortune because they were made so thin, but they were definitely worth a substantial amount of money. So he was quite happy. He started thinking about using that money to pay off some of his bills. Then he noticed that there was also a piece of paper inside. And he looked at it more closely. He saw that it was a letter from his father addressed to him, the only son. The letter explained that, as he expected, this painting was his inheritance. His father wrote that many years ago, when he had to escape their ancestral home to the north, he had to escape the chaos and warfare that occurred at the time. When he needed to do that, he converted part of the family's wealth into gold, and then had a smith work them into thin pieces so he could easily hide them behind the painting. And this allowed him to eventually be able to carry the gold to the present home in the south. Then the letter continued. Son, the real treasure is the painting itself, hidden in plain sight. Most people won't recognize it, but it is by far the most prized original by the most revered artist of the previous dynasty. When the war is over and peace prevails, civilization will return to the land. At that time, you can sell the painting to the highest bidder. You will find that it is easily worth a room full of gold. The son is stunned by the last part of the letter. He looked at the many pieces of ripped painting at his feet. That room full of gold his father promised had just evaporated into thin air. So, as a challenge for everyone, if you heard the explanation for chapter 26, I want to challenge you by asking you, what is the connection between the story and the lesson of the chapter? In particular, the dichotomy of light and heavy. As you are hopefully typing in your thoughts, I want to say that the heaviness Lao Tzu talks about in chapter 26, I think you can figure out that it has nothing to do with the weight of gold in the story, the extra heaviness of the painting in the story. No, it's got nothing to do with that. By heavy, Lao Tzu is referring to a slower, more mindful way to live. It's the Tao because it emphasizes the importance of calmness over excitement. Specifically, what I mean is that if the young man was able to remain calm, he would have been able to control his excitement. You know, this frenzy, the frantic rush, the urge to tear into the painting, he would have been able to control that. He could have given the painting a much more in-depth scrutiny before proceeding. And if he had done so, he probably would have been able to find that there were latches in the back of the wooden frame to open it up so he could easily get at the gold leaves without ripping out the painting. And I can see that you guys are definitely in tune with that. As Tim says, his desire to get at the gold caused him to rip the painting, to overlook what was a more subtle joy. And indeed, Francis, it's all about being patient and being careful not to be in a rush. You can tell that being in a rush would be what Lao Tzu points to as being light, fluttering like a butterfly. To be patient and be careful is the heavy aspect of it. And Carol, you are also correct. If the young man hadn't been so impatient to get at the gold, he would have figured out a non-destructive way to take the back off. Absolutely. He should have valued his father's well-loved painting more. Also, another thought that I want to offer to everyone about this story is that at a higher level, the painting and the gold leaves are meant to be symbolic. That is, the gold leaves can represent short-term gain, and the painting would then be the much greater long-term gain, long-term benefit. Thus, the idea is that when you are impulsive, short-sighted, given to whims and mood swings, you can easily be tempted by short-term gain and lose out on the much greater long-term benefit. So here is a more formal analysis. I think everyone got the idea, which is great. let me specifically detail out how the spectrum of light and heavy can be seen in this story. And I also want to encourage everyone to think in terms of the yin and yang symbol. So remember, the Tao is never about one or the other. It's always a balance of the two. So in this particular yin and yang symbol, you've got basically fire and ice. So fire, in this particular case, would represent light, the lightness. It's transient, it's fast moving, it's here and then it's gone. The heavy aspect will be represented by the ice. So it's much more permanent, it's much more lasting. So specifically, let me point to light and heavy as it applies to the young man's state of mind. So imagine what his thoughts were like as he was dealing with the painting. You've got, in that spectrum of light to heavy, on the left-hand side, you've got the light part. You have the thoughtless versus the heavier, thoughtful, deeper thinking is what it's saying. That thoughtlessness leads to unwarranted assumptions. The unwarranted assumption in this case is that the painting was of little to no value. Now, examination eventually would reveal that if you proceed without assumptions. So being presumptuous, being thoughtless, all lead to being careless. And careful, in this case, will be the heavy side, as would examination. So this is the mental aspect of it. Then, in the story, the thoughtless assumption, the carelessness, it led to excitement. It led to this frantic gold rush, if you will. So in the spectrum, the heavy side will be calmness, the heavy side will be deliberate and not frantic. And rather than to rush into something, the heavy approach will be pausing to take a breath, to assess the situation, to look at it from different angles, different perspectives, before deciding what to do. And that leads to the last part of it. So action, observation. Action is on the lighter side, observation is on the heavy side. So the idea is to it's not so much about always observe, never act. The yin and yang symbol reminds us that it's always a balance between the two. And the idea really is that we need to observe more before acting. So in the West, we do have a saying that in doing, for instance, carpentry, that you measure twice and cut once. To measure twice is to be careful that your measurements are correct. And once you are sure, you cut once, rather than being careless and sloppy with your measurement, so that when you cut, you realize that you've cut the wrong dimension and you have to go back in and cut again, and perhaps again and again. It's the same idea. Then lastly, it's chaos and order. So chaos will be like the burning flames, and the order will be the heavy side. It will be what we want to cultivate more. So in life, this is not saying that you should not allow yourself any excitement. You should only have calmness. Rather, the yin and yang symbol, once again, reminds us that the proper balance is needed. I would say that Lao Tzu provides us with good advice, because our overall tendency especially now in the modern world, it is often tilted too much to the side of light, the lightness, which means tilted towards being careless, being thoughtless, too much devotion and emphasis on things being exciting, so that you rush ahead frantically, you take action before you're ready. This is reflected whenever young people say, but that's so boring. Okay, well, they are victims of too much emphasis on the colors, the light, the excitement on that side of the spectrum. So what Lao Tzu is trying to say is that we can attain a better balance by pulling back from the light side and emphasizing the heavy side more, to be more thoughtful, careful, more calm, more deliberate, and so on. That would be the way to live. Okay, so that is the idea behind the story, The Inheritance. I hope you have enjoyed that story. And now we're ready to go to the paraphrase of chapter 26. So we start out right away with this talk of heaviness, lightness, quietness, and restlessness. So how can we paraphrase that into the modern vernacular? Here's what I would suggest. Serious, deep thoughts form the foundation of life, and therefore have greater importance than the lighter emotions. Similarly, quiet contemplation gives us mastery over situations and is therefore more useful than impulsive rashness. And we now move into the second section, that's lines 3 and 4. This is about traveling. The sages travel an entire day, which is metaphoric for traveling the journey of life. Then line 4 talks about the heavy supplies. Those are the essentials, the basics, the fundamentals. So here's how I would like to paraphrase that. This is why sages never lose sight of the fundamental essentials as they travel the journey of life. Their approach is a combination of serious intent, mindful awareness, careful contemplation, as well as self-examination. So actual sages from the authentic Tao tradition would never say things like, as we do in the West, we oftentimes say things like, go with the flow. We do that so much, it's become a cliche. The actual sages will be much more deliberate. They would think it through, and if they see that as a good idea to go with the flow, that's exactly what they will do. But if they see that it's better to nudge in a particular direction, they will take minimal unattached action to do so. So it isn't always going with the flow. It really depends on the situation. Next, we get to luxurious sights and being composed and being able to transcend beyond that. So as you may recall from our talk last time, there's a whole bunch of visual metaphors involved. That the luxurious sights originally derived from sight of a grand palace, and then being composed and being able to transcend that came from visual metaphor of a bird resting peacefully in its nest. So let's paraphrase it in the following way. Although they come across luxurious sights and seductive distractions, they are able to maintain their composure, transcend the temptations, and keep themselves on the path. They only need to remind themselves of their true purpose. Okay, good. Now, in the next to last section, we get into perhaps the most striking visual metaphor in this entire chapter, and that's being the Lord, the controller, the master of 10,000 chariots. And that's a metaphor, of course, for managing the many things that occur in your life. So I would like to paraphrase it this way. Living one's life well is like an emperor ruling the empire, or a military general commanding 10,000 chariots. It's a responsibility that cannot be taken lightly, because life is a gift we should never take for granted. So, I guess the serious question is, how many of us are living the intentional or mindful life? Are we wasting the precious days that we have in this world? I can tell you that before discovering the Tao, I was definitely wasting my days away, oftentimes without realizing that's what I was doing. So let's finish up the paraphrase. The last section is a reiteration of the first, that it emphasizes the consequences of not heeding the advice from the Tao and to still be light and airy and irresponsible, flitting around, not really that serious. There's negative consequences associated with that. Same with being restless rather than quietly thoughtful. So here's how I would like to paraphrase the last part. If we are superficial in approaching life, we are likely to lose out on the essentials. If we are thoughtless in approaching a situation, we are likely to lose control of it. In order to attain mastery, we must emulate the sages and emphasize the serious and the quiet. So there we are. That formally closes off our discussion on 26. So I hope you got as much out of it as I did. And now it's time to head into 27.
Our meeting has come to an end, but the journey continues on. Let us travel safely. Until next time, may the Tao fill you with peace and happiness.